Welcome, everybody, to our panel on academic freedom. Usually, academics are not a popular topic or a topic in the media. We're generally forgotten, mostly ignored. We've been talking about climate change now for 100 years, over 100 years. People are just starting to notice that maybe something is happening with the climate. But suddenly academics are also in the news in terms of their freedoms and what they're up to. And we're seeing various threats and discussions, both from the political right and arguably perhaps also from the political left. Threats to academic freedom in terms of what we research and what we can and how we can express ourselves. And we have two representatives today from countries which have featured very much in these discussions. Brazil and Turkey, amongst others. Major discussions right now happening in Afghanistan as to what will be the consequences for academic freedom in universities and higher education sector in Afghanistan, which has expanded considerably in the last 20 years. There's also been concerns that the political left is driving so-called cancel culture, in which we, people, restricting the types of discussions that we can have and avoiding, politically sensitive discussions in the name of other norms and restricting, therefore, academic freedoms. That's just two aspects of academic freedoms. One could talk about many more aspects. For example, when we are paid to do research by external organizations, whether it's governments, research councils, whether it's corporations, whether we're restricted in what we can actually report on. There's also discussions about academic capitalism, in the sense that we're caught up in this cycle of producing so much that we're actually losing our own freedom to research what we really want to research. And there's questions around our working environments, which are becoming more structured, more managerial, and does that also affect our daily freedoms? But we're going to focus mostly on the political today, the first two things that I named. And we have, this week, our first manel. We're all men. Usually that's, a big no-no. But hopefully you'll forgive us. Throughout the week, we have, very strong gender equality. But for this session, we are manel. But we are diverse in terms of country and diverse in terms of experience. And we have a longtime friend of the Bergen Exchanges, Professor Tom Keck at the University of Syracuse, who's an expert on US constitutional politics. And both, so-called threats from the right and the left have featured very much in US discussions, where US, also university campuses have also been at the center of this, where there's been also tradition about, having many public events on university campuses. We also have another long-time friend of the exchanges, Professor Conrado Mendes from Brazil, who's been very engaged in a range of issues on judicial independence and freedoms, but also academic freedoms, and has been recently in the media himself in relation to his own speech on political and judicial legal issues. Finally, we have a new friend of the Bergen Exchanges, Sen, from Turkey, who did his PhD at the University in Switzerland, who can also tell us about threats in Turkey to academic freedom. So, without further ado, I'll give the word first to Tom to share his reflections. And Tom not only is an expert on US constitutional politics, he leads a project funded by the American Research Foundation on freedom of expression, a comparative project looking at many countries around the world. So he is also quite comparatively involved. Thanks, Tom.
Thanks, Malcolm. I am indeed a longtime friend of the Bergen Exchanges, and I'm sorry we can't all be there together in person, hopefully next year. And thanks so much to Thierry and others for the invitation to join this panel, and I look forward to the conversation. In addition to all the generous things Malcolm mentioned about my work, I also note that I'm the chair of the Academic Freedom panel on my campus, and so some of my reflections draw on my own experience, sort of observing and firsthand and trying to resolve some disputes about academic freedom here on one particular US campus. So I don't know if there's anybody here besides me who regularly reads media coverage of US higher education. But if there is, you might be led to believe that the chief threat to academic freedom in the United States is leftist undergrads who are intolerant of ideas that they disagree with. I think this is a misperception, and I think it's a dangerous misperception because it leads us to lose sight of what are, in my view, greater threats to academic freedom. I don't want to spend too much time on this point because I want to shift our attention to the graver threats. But I was an undergraduate student in the late 1980s and early 1990s at a small liberal arts college in Ohio that was widely considered a hotbed of leftist political activism. And throughout that entire time, there was breathless national media coverage of cancel culture. We didn't call it that back then. The term didn't exist yet. We called it political correctness. But the stories about intolerant left-wing undergraduates were pretty close to identical to the stories that we read today about intolerant left-wing undergraduates. And in my view, they were a caricature then, and they're a caricature now, right? So I don't want to say that the problems associated with cancel culture don't exist at all, but I think they are exaggerated. I think the scope and nature and frequency of them are exaggerated. And left-wing undergraduate students are not the chief threat to academic freedom in the United States by a long shot. The chief threat to academic freedom in the United States, in my view, is well-resourced conservative actors and organizations who have long objected to the mission of universities as sites of critical independent research and teaching. The key current example of this threat is the wave of subnational legislation we've been seeing this year seeking to outlaw the teaching of critical race theory. Now, critical race theory, as many of you know, is a specific movement originating in US law schools back in the 1980s. And that's the term that's been adopted. But if you read these actual laws, what they're actually attempting to ban or regulate is basically any honest teaching about racism in US political history. These laws are obviously unconstitutional, but they've been pushed by well-funded conservative actors, including key leaders in the Republican Party. And unless and until US courts invalidate them, they are backed by the power of the state. And we've already seen examples of universities canceling courses, and it's even a more severe threat at the primary and secondary level of teachers changing what they're teaching because the state is telling them they're not allowed to teach critical race theory. These laws just got started a few months ago, but in my view, they've already had a more substantial negative impact on academic freedom in the United States than all of the efforts by left-wing undergraduate students to deplatform conservative speakers and the like. It's also worth noting that the same Republican legislators who've been banning critical race theory have also been passing laws to enable voter suppression and even election subversion, right? So Dan Brinks talked about some of these developments yesterday. So it's probably worth thinking more about the interconnections between these attacks on academic freedom and the dynamics of democratic backsliding more generally, because it's the same actors engaged in both, right? The same actors who are, in my view, the principal threat to academic freedom in the United States at the moment are also the principal drivers of voter suppression and election subversion efforts that are a key component of our current problem with democratic backsliding. To sum up our current democratic dilemma in a sentence or two, I would say that one of our two major political parties, right, the National Republican Party, which has been our dominant governing party since 1980, is resorting to increasingly desperate measures to stave off the electoral consequences of the country's steadily increasing racial diversity, rather than seeking to appeal to voters of color by offering policy proposals of interest to such voters. Key Republican leaders have doubled down on their commitment to a white nationalist vision of the country's past and future, and are sabotaging key democratic norms and institutions in an effort to maintain their minority hold on power. Now, the fight over what's happening on US campuses is not the most important front in that fight, right? I mean, US campuses are a little bit of a sideshow when it comes to political power, but it is a front in that fight, right? The effort to erode the quality of US democracy is enabled in part by seeking to undermine the role of universities as sites of critical independent research and teaching. Right? It's not the most important front, but it is a front in that fight. And so that's one key takeaway point, is just that the folks who are seeking to undermine democratic norms and institutions in the United States are the same folks who are the chief threat to academic freedom in the United States at present. Right? So that's one key takeaway. A second key takeaway I'd like to leave everyone with, and this is maybe just in the interest of time, I'm just going to sort of more put this out there as something for us to think and talk a little bit about. But that is about the relationship between the concepts of academic freedom and free speech. As Malcolm mentioned, I've been studying free speech for a long time. The two concepts overlap in some ways, but they are distinct. And I think it's important, at least in the United States, and I think maybe elsewhere as well, I think it's important for us to tease apart the relationship between these two concepts a little bit. And here, I'm really drawing on a great recent book by Adrian Stone and Carolyn Evans called Open Mind, which is about academic freedom, mostly in Australia. And I highly recommend it. So I don't know if this is true elsewhere, but in the United States, the recent wave of legislative attacks on academic freedom, including the anti-critical race theory laws, have often been advanced in the name of free speech, right? The advocates of those laws, which ban the teaching of certain subject matter, claim to be defending freedom of speech, right? The argument is that teachers are indoctrinating white students by forcing them to espouse ideas about structural racism that they don't agree with, and hence that we have to ban faculty from teaching those ideas altogether. Now, that's a crazy argument, right? But it is, I'm not making it up. It is a real argument that has been advanced over and over by elected lawmakers and elected subnational executives, right? Governors and state legislators in the US. In support of these laws, right? And these laws are not the only example. They're the most prominent one, but they're not the only one. So briefly, if you think of academic freedom, if you think of a Venn diagram of academic freedom and free speech, right? They are overlapping concepts, right? But only parts of the circles are overlapping, right? And there are some things that are threats to academic freedom and free speech. There are some things that are threats to one, but not the other. And there are times in which they pull in opposite directions, right? And so we can talk more about this in discussion, but I guess the point I want to leave everyone with is that freedom of speech is a fundamental prerequisite of democratic governance. I'm a big advocate of it in general. We should structure state institutions as best we can to ensure that state power is not deployed to silence government critics and the like. I'm 100% on board with that. But on university campuses, the principle that is necessary to the performance of their mission is academic freedom, not freedom of speech. And some exaggerated conceptions of freedom of speech can actually be used to attack and undermine academic freedom, right? If you believe that students are allowed to say anything they want to say wherever they want to say it without consequence, then it is impossible to teach a university class, right? I mean, the professor loses all control of the classroom, right? A disruptive student can't be silenced, right? And so that professor has to have the authority over his or her classroom, and those concepts are rooted in academic freedom. And often the two concepts will go together, but there are instances in which they pull in opposite directions. And at least in the United States, we have a lot of well-resourced political actors pushing exaggerated accounts of free speech in ways that I think are increasingly threats to academic freedom. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks, Tom. And your comments are actually in many ways very relevant to Norway, in which the Higher Education Minister just a few weeks ago announced a new public commission on academic freedom, with the main articulated ground, at least for the media, was concerns around the political left and cancel culture. The appointed chair of the commission, Anita Sherwood, came out and actually said, well, at least from her perspective, that's probably not the major issue. It's actually the financing of research in Norway, perhaps the greatest threat. But we see even, say, centre-right politicians in Norway playing the game that you're talking about. Hopefully not the same consequences in Norway, but certainly a similar pattern. So thanks for going through that, and also very importantly clarifying the relationship between academic freedom and freedom of expression, which we need to keep in mind as we go forward. So let's move to a slightly different context, Brazil, where you've also had one party in politics, or particularly a president, very interested in what happens on universities. Conrado.
It's a pleasure to be here again at Bergen Exchanges. I didn't prepare a very systematic presentation on the situation of Brazil, but I want to say and to start with a few words about how we are experiencing this particular government in relation to academic freedom. And I wanted to start by saying that my case is an interesting case, because I've been involved with research in academic freedom for 2 or 3 years now, and I've been witnessing, as far as I can see, a sort of rebirth or a growing interest about academic freedom in different places in the world. And I personally got the chance to participate in a particular research led by a German think tank called Global Public Policy Institute, a think tank that engaged in the last couple of years in trying to develop a kind of global index on academic freedom. And they advanced this research, and then in partnership with the Center Varieties of Democracies, that produces one of the most respected comparative analyses on the quality of democracies in the world. And the GPPI, Global Public Policy Institute, together with them, incorporated in their quality assessment of democracy the index of academic freedom. And I was here and helping them through the Brazilian case, which was already studying academic freedom. Then in 2018, Bolsonaro election came, and 2 years later, or three or 4 months ago, I became myself involved, not as a researcher, but as a target of a practice of intimidation. But what I want to say, just to give a brief overview of the Brazilian case, and of course the growing interest in academic freedom is very much related to the wave of autocratization in the world. We know, as Malcolm said, and then Tom also said, there are multiple angles and types of discussion related to threats to academic freedom. Some of them take place in reasonably well-working democracies, so to say. What Malcolm said about academic capitalism, the sort of managerialism, private money driving research agendas, resource cuts, etc. This is a particular context, and many other debates also take place. But another context is the context of democratic backsliding, a context in which academic freedom obviously does not, the threats to academic freedom does not go alone, but actually basically the whole package of basic freedom: freedom of the press, artistic freedom, academic freedom, and freedom of assembly, and so on. So there is a very common sort of attack on all this package of basic freedoms. And it is important to say that these sorts of particular authoritarian threats to academic freedom did not start actually with Bolsonaro's election. There has been, in the last couple of years, a sort of right-wing and extreme right-wing wave of stigmatizing universities, and through the stigmatization of universities and the sort of alleged left indoctrination that take place in these places, these attacks has been publicly justified. Not only the attacks, but also this goes along with funding cuts. So to mention just a few examples, and starting in 2018, which is the year of the election of Bolsonaro, but we could go a little bit further backwards to the past. But let's say 2018, after Dilma Rousseff impeachment, which was already a very intense climate against left wing and the caricature built upon what universities and public universities are doing. And just to open a short footnote, Brazilian university system is basically composed by public universities that are stable, give a lot of academic freedom in terms of stability, and public universities do basically 95% of a scientific research in the country. And there is a private system which is basically dedicated to teaching in higher education. But there is a really strong and really well accomplished system of public universities in Brazil. But 2018, there's the Ministry of Education has threatened a professor of the University of Brasilia, for example, who decided to teach a course called The Coup of 2016. As you know, there is a strong rhetorical dispute about how to call Dilma Rousseff's impeachment. And to call it a coup is highly politically charged. So the Ministry of Education basically threatened a professor who was trying to do that. The election of 2018 was highly tense in terms of the political events that were taking place in universities, debates about fascism, authoritarianism, etc. So police agents have invaded some universities to interrupt that sort of event. In 2019, when Bolsonaro's government started, there is a really, on the one hand, a really stark program of budget cuts. Those budget cuts were sometimes selective, punishing particular universities, public universities that were developing some sort of critical or event or somehow stimulating debate on authoritarianism. Scholarships were cut, and these cuts again were really discriminatory in terms of what was given to humanities and so on. In terms of discursive practices, in terms of public image of universities, this government has invested a lot of effort in terms of characterizing. This is an old practice, but they have reinforced this practice of basically stigmatizing and characterizing public universities as a place of drugs, sex, and rock and roll, which no one has ever seen, but basically characterize universities public universities as a racket. several events, but let me just say a few words about my particular case, which is part of one particular wave in the last 6 months or so during the pandemic. That there has been a sort of lawfare against professors, on the one hand, who are contributing with scientific knowledge to tackle the pandemic. So basically producing important scientific information, which goes against the denialist policy, denialist attitude and approach of our government. So these scientists, this also goes along with climate scientists. That's another topic. So both climate denial and pandemic denial goes against what Brazilian scientists are saying in these areas. So they have been particularly targets of this. The public sphere has been really aggressive against the president, using strong words to characterize the president. Among the strong words, perhaps the strongest one is genocide, an agent of genocide. And the government has been suing and pursuing those who have used these sorts of words, basically through police investigations and criminal lawsuits and etc. And I'm particularly, my case is a bit unique because I haven't been sued by any governmental agent. I've been sued by really high authorities of the justice system who are definitely associated with Bolsonaro's government, but they are not actually or formally members of the government. They are members first. The Attorney General is the highest authority of Brazilian prosecutor's office, who is the main authority with the responsibility to provide or to hold the president accountable. So he basically sued me. He attacked me on two fronts. He went to the university and presented a complaint in the ethical committee, accusing me of defamation through my weekly op-ed column. So not in an academic article, not in an academic event, but in my op-ed weekly opinion in a widely circulated Brazilian newspaper. This was the first front. The second front was a criminal case, a defamation criminal case in the judiciary. So this was more than 3 months ago, and a month ago, a second high authority, basically a justice of the Supreme Court, a justice that was recently appointed by Bolsonaro, also presented a complaint which has not become yet a criminal case, but it's still in the phase of investigation, also based on a criticism that I wrote in my op-ed column. This is really, really serious because, as opposed to those investigations started by the government, which have been creating a climate of apprehension in the whole academic community, in the whole journalistic community, but they have tended to finish more or less early. They take 1 or 2 months, and then they are shelved. In my case, the perspective is a sort of long distance running because it's already has become a judicial case, and it is not officially associated with the government. And I call the whole package of practices a sort of state of intimidation. And as you know, the point of intimidation is not to win the case. It's just to harass particular agents and to silence the whole academic community by creating a climate of fear. The victory is not to have a favorable sentence or judicial decision in the end. their victory is to promote self-censorship. And of course, this is already happening. And the most serious angle, in my opinion as well, is and in my case somehow is a case in which academic freedom and freedom of speech to some extent overlap, because the Attorney General basically knocked at the university's door, claiming that I could not write a notepad in the newspaper using my identity as a university professor to criticize himself. So that there is a very important and interesting debate about the overlaps and differences between freedom of speech and academic freedom that we could debate further. But I just wanted to start by saying this in a little unorganized way, but that's what I wanted to start with.
Fantastic, Conrado. I mean, it's terrifying hearing also of your own ordeal and what you had to go through and what you're now facing in terms of ongoing persecution. But thanks for sharing both the political landscape but also your personal terrain in this particular issue. Perhaps less thanks for demystifying universities as not places of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. You know, we've been trying to keep up that image, but yeah, most of the work we do is rather boring and pedestrian. So going on from Brazil to Turkey, we'll now have a third perspective from Gökhan Sen, as I mentioned, who's also worked in Switzerland. Thank you.
As Conrad mentioned, that the issue of academic freedom is maybe subsumed under the general problem of the authoritarianism and the contemporary era. And also, I agree with Thomas when he said it is more often than not, more often than always, the right-wing or religious or nationalist extremists who pose threat against academic threat, rather than the cancel culture of the left-wing segment of the society, if I understood it well. What the cancel culture serve negatively to academic freedom may be, and well, to any sort of freedom, is enhancing the legitimacy of the authoritarians alliance with some segment of the society who are mostly mediocre and resentful of hardworking and educated and intellectual people, which in populist settings is termed to be a praise for ignorance. And that is one of the reasons, I believe, that's one of the reasons behind, or the motives behind the authoritarians' attack on academic freedom, particularly in populist authoritarian policies, which the case in Turkey openly is a proof for that. And I believe the cases in Brazil, not believe, but intuitively, I think the cases of Brazil or other places, in other cases like in Hungary, where the academics are under attack. So the case of Turkey it may be wrong, not wrong, but maybe overuse of words like academic or democratic backlash or democratic backsliding, because Turkey has always had its problems with democracy. We had a bit of time between late 90s and early 2000s that there was a hope for democracy, for a better democracy. It was always partly free, according to Freedom House, for example. We had a hope for democracy, but then we had this disappointment. So I cannot really talk about real democratic backlash. Maybe I can talk about some sort of Terminator movie using the last moment that the villain is dead, but he resurrects again, something like that. So we have old authoritarianism in Turkey and new populist authoritarianism. The difference is this. And between that, we had a little bit of nice times, nice spring times without rain and dark. But then we have a new era of authoritarianism, which has changed. So if I want to compare old authoritarianism and new ones, the old authoritarianism or old conservatism, which was very comparable to Latin American 60s, 70s sort of military juntas, where the nationality or nation pride or protection of the state was the first aim of the state, and the individual autonomy could be easily sacrificed for protection of some sort of abstraction of state. More concretely, the military-made 1982 Constitution, Latin American friends will easily understand me. It's the same, it's more or less the same circumstances that the constitutions are made. The military takes over the power and forces disappearances, killings, tortures, and there's a new constitution which is elitist in the nature, and which is, as to the higher education, provides a very centralized higher education structure, seeing the academy with the students and researchers as a potential threat for national security. Take, for example, still 1982 Constitution says the academy freedom means researchers and students and assistants are free to learn and publish academic contents, but this freedom should not be used against the integrity of the state, the existence of state, and indivisibility of nation. So it is like a remnant of military conservatist, nationalist, and right-wing constitutionalism of Turkey. So this reflects the autocratarianism, protecting the state against individual, and seeing the politics as an elite business, and the contaminating the campuses from politics. By a little contrast, or adding a little bit cream on the top of this, there is Erdogan's populist authoritarianism, which we're facing now, which is imbued with anti-elitism, anti-institutionalism, and a sort of cultural war. As many of you may know, populist authoritarians are notoriously known for their anti-elitist discourse, referring to some sort of genuine people and who are morally pure against the corrupt elite. Erdogan's attack on universities have this motive, I believe, where he uses some sort of old authoritarianism elements, but his main motive is this attack aiming at colonizing the academia, as in the case of any other anti-majoritarian state institutions. Turkish case may also be, the academic case may also be noted as a culture war of Erdogan, because he said once, a couple of years ago, and I never forget when he said that, having the political power is one thing, having the cultural and social power, artistic power is another thing. We have been in power for 14 years now in a row, but we have never been perfect in establishing our cultural and political power, in parentheses, hegemony. And this may be very well understood when he attacks on the, not only academia, but also on arts and on other cultural or intellectual areas of Turkish life. So this is a natural brother and sister with mediocrity, where the culture of ignorance, post-truth, and resentment against hardworking intellectuals and educated people has become a mainstream in many of the forums. And this cancel culture indirectly maybe feeds this resentment, feeling of resentment. And this turns out to be a polarization of the society, and at least half of the population, because in every part of the history, at least half of the population is somewhat ignorant, as opposed to some readers or some, artist lovers or sophisticated people. But this time we are passing through the times that there are natural alliances with the authoritarian governments. And so I may divide Turkish case into three. One is the Academics for Peace case, where also I was a part of it. In 2016, a petition was released as a press. There was a press release also about 2,000 academics calling the state to stop the human rights violations in Turkey, in southeastern Kurdish provinces of Turkey, and compensate the loss of the victims of state terror. Right after that, there was a smear campaign, and it was very with a populist tone. Erdogan said, if you insist on clashing with the values of the people, as opposed to not territorial integrity, but clashing with the values of the real people, you will drown into your ugliness, he said, right after this press release of our petition. Also, the smear campaign again, the reference to cancel culture, because the authoritarians learn from the cancel culture technique, so they have their own troll, internet troll army. And recently, Twitter had to close down about 3,000 accounts from Turkey, just because of being trolls, pro-government trolls, paid just to give some tweets for the government. And there was a ton of resentment was evident in that smear campaign, accusing the academics of accusing the states from which they took their money, which was in quite modest in fact, but in their eyes, which was quite opulent. So this was also another discourse that could be subsumed under this. And there's also a convicted mafia leader, Sedat Peker, who said that in an article, in a blog post in his website, that we will come for you, we will shed your blood, and we will swim in it. And at the same time, we were in front of the judge trying to persuade him that what we did was not terrorist propaganda, but on the contrary, it was call for peace. But Sedat Peker was in front of the judge, who threatened 2,000 people slithering and swimming in their blood. And the same court, same sort of court, said that it was freedom of speech, but it was not for those who signed the petition. I was lucky enough to have been sentenced because a last-minute Turkish Constitutional Court case saved us from that. And it is as a pleasant surprise to many Turkish audience, because Turkish Constitutional Court has been completely packed and tamed. But as I think, as rational actors, and as being slightly part of European Court of Human Rights area, they knew the costs of being so anti-blatantly anti-constitutional. So every now and then, they give decisions against the interests of the government, and ours was, by luck, was one of them. So we got lucky not to get into the prison. Some of our friends had to stay about from 2 to 6 months because they were sentenced earlier. But right after the Constitutional Court decision, they were released. So this is one aspect of that. The second aspect, I'm going to keep them shorter because I think I'll be talking for a while.
You have 5 minutes.
I got 5 minutes, right. The second aspect is the institutional. Dividing the second aspect of academic attack is the institutional, dividing the long-standing academic institutions into two, then packing the latter with their loyalists. And this was made by the law. And in that way, 20 or so universities were mutilated in the biggest part of Turkey, and the best universities. They were the best universities, like in Istanbul, in Ankara, in Izmir, in the big cities. And it became in front of the Constitutional Court, and despite a autonomy provision of the Constitution, the Constitutional Court said that it was in the discretion of the legislative majority to do whatever with the universities. So this is also another story. There are also more subtle ways, like, well, it is natural to assume that in that atmosphere, there's a mass mobbing, harassment, and intimidation. And the recent study shows that in 2021, from 15 interviewees from different universities, said that because of the too much stress and political polarization, they tend to be self-isolation, self-censorship, and overusing prescribed drugs and alcoholism. To conclude, I may also share with you an anecdotal evidence. Right after I came to hear, 3 of my colleagues from the universities that I used to work in, where I was purged, had to face disciplinary proceedings, among other things, because of continuing their friendship with me. And where I appeared as one of the members of a secret terrorist organization, of which roots may be traced back to an occult, Masonic, feminist, Marxist, and Islamist establishment. Well, I'm really happy that you understood that, because I was really wondering if it was cultural context, but it's really shocking, and it's really post-truth, and it's really absurd thing. It's like a cocktail where you put Fidel Castro and Taliban in the same place, or then Venezuelan guerrillas with the ISIS people, and then some sort of gender movement people in the same place that they are doing whatever in the dark. We don't know. So I appear as one of the members of the church organization. I just want to share this to show the absurdity of this the current state back in Turkey. Yeah, thank you very much for listening.
Oh. So thanks very much, Gorkan, for that fascinating but also personal account of what's happened in Turkey. And you, like many other Turkish scholars, have had to leave the country.
Yes.
Many throughout Europe at the moment, including in Norway, under our Scholars at Risk program. I mean, analytically, I think you make a really important point about old authoritarianism. That's conservative authoritarianism and security-based authoritarianism, and new populist-based authoritarianism. And I think that would also apply to the West if we just push it a little bit back to, say, to the 50s and 60s. And the attacks on academic freedom were basically under the shadow of the Cold War. So communists in academia were surveilled, they were harassed. I mean, in the US, particularly in the McCarthy areas, but also in Europe, in Australia, and elsewhere. So I think that's actually, this is a bit of a longue durée perspective is really important. That is, it's not something new. There is a pattern here, but now we have this new populist authoritarianism, and that perhaps what unites all of these stories here. Again, US, Turkey, and Brazil. We could also talk about Hungary, as you mentioned, and others. So we're going to open up. Oh, I also have to say, I mean, I think everybody now wants to research this cult, which was feminist, Marxist, Islamic, and
feminist, Marxist, and Masonic. Somewhere he was also talking about Knight of the Temple.
Knight of the Temple. So it's I think Dan Brown's next novel will actually be about this cult. So Simone de Beauvoir meets Fidel Castro meets the Taliban. Meets the secret world order all in one. Fantastic. You definitely have to upgrade your CV to include that.
Yeah, I'll do.
So we're going to open up now for questions from our physical audience, from our digital audience. But I so take the microphone here or send a question in chat. But I'm just wondering. Tom, if you want to reflect on what you've heard so far from Conrad and Gorkan.
Sure. No, I mean, thanks so much to Gorkan and Conrado for sharing their stories. And, so like on the one hand, right, the stories from Turkey and Brazil put the US experience in some perspective, right? I mean, we don't have mass purging of professors here in the United States. We don't have widespread police incursions onto US campuses, right? So that the threats to academic freedom, and maybe this is true in terms of democratic backsliding more broadly, right? With our democratic institutions and our civil society institutions being so longstanding and in some ways more firmly established here than elsewhere. So on the one hand, there's a contrast between what's going on in the US and elsewhere. But on the other hand, there are some really clear parallels, right? As Malcolm just mentioned, the source of what all three of us are characterizing as the key threats to academic freedom currently in our home countries are parallel authoritarian populist movements, right? Thankfully, that movement is not currently in charge of the U.S. government, but that was like a near thing in January of this year, and the movement is still in charge of many key state institutions, right? Particularly subnational institutions, right? So one of the distinctive features, I don't know if distinctive is the right word, but one key feature of democratic backsliding in the U.S., right, is that in our federal structure, right, in our famously decentralized structure of lawmaking, where we have both horizontal and vertical divisions of power that are so firmly entrenched, the movement that was dislodged from the presidency still maintains control of basically veto points at the federal level and full lawmaking control at key subnational levels. And so they are able to continue attacking academic freedom and continue to engage in other elements of democratic backsliding, even though Donald Trump no longer holds the presidency, right? And so, so those parallels to me are really striking. Like we're all like, I don't think we've dodged the bullet yet in the United States, right? I mean, I think the like bullet is still like suspended in air somewhere, like aiming at us, and we're still facing many of the same threats. Although, again, it plays out differently in different places, and I don't want to exaggerate the threats to academic freedom in the United States because they are in many respects less severe than they are elsewhere in the world. But I was struck by, I already knew this about Turkey and Brazil, but just hearing it with the firsthand stories, just the extent to which these movements across all three countries are really posing dangerous threats to academic freedom in particular and to democracy more broadly.
Thanks, Tom. And so I want to pose a question to all of you about how academics respond to these threats. What sort of conditions or actions often help academics in these situations? Because it's hard to see really a global movement for academic freedom. So there's questions about what sort of global solidarity there is. Is it alliances with other actors that helps one, whether it's journalists or maybe judges? Where there have been successes, or one has been able to hold back this threat, what actually works? I mean, it's fascinating, as Tom says, that, even just courses are cancelled. I mean, universities are so afraid that in the US, with all the constitutional and institutional protections, that you actually cancel a course, which is sort of the core of academic freedom. So it's sort of interesting. So on the positive side, where there has been successful resistance, what are the conditions for it, and how might it therefore be encouraged?
Gökhan, we want to start?
No, you can, yeah.
Okay. Of course, I don't have a very reflected answer on that. I'm learning a lot as someone, as I said, who started by doing research and getting involved with public debate about academic freedom, and then as a target. What I would say is that, of course, all expressions of solidarity, both by the national academic community and international academic community, and apart from the academic community, solidarity from media, public sphere, and civil society is a sort of very important and first step. And we are good at doing that. We academics are good in writing articles and those manifestos signed by hundreds of people, and I received all that sort of support. But I think that's far below what we actually need to learn how to do. And this means something that academics are not always very good at, which is political articulation, political mobilization. We are very good at producing a lot of noise, but this noise fades out quite soon after a couple of days or a couple of weeks. And then after that dissipates, the rhythm of bureaucracy doesn't care about all that noise, and the judicial case keeps going on, and they manage their own timing. So the way is to learn how to face bureaucracies, and there is we need to get involved with that, and different things can be done so that academics are not only reactive towards attacks, but they are already mobilized before something happens, so that academics alone are not caught by surprise without knowing what to do. And it's a privilege of mine to be a professor of law and to be highly connected with the legal community. Because, for example, the epidemiologist, which doesn't have a clue about law and legal implications about what he's doing, he was forced to sign a sort of agreement, an important Brazilian epidemiologist who called Bolsonaro genocidal, but basically didn't know what to do, and there was no organization to help him react. He was taken by surprise, and so this is one second thing, to be organized, to promote the idea of academic freedom preventively, not only reactively. Actually, we took for granted academic freedom. And in 1 year or 2 years, we are just facing really serious threats, which I guess is not yet at the stage of purging professors or arresting or compulsory retirements and so on, which we knew by the military dictatorship. We are at a previous stage, and perhaps we will stay in this previous stage of just intimidation and defunding and making public universities less powerful and less relevant to the public sphere. And apart from that, apart from organizing, there is also the sort of backdoors conversation with important political actors. This includes members of parliament. This includes important members of the justice system, judges, prosecutors. We need to build the broadest coalition we can. And in terms of coalition, it's an advantage to include people that are advocating for freedom of the press, artistic freedom, which has been really deeply affected by Bolsonaro's government. Not to mention the pandemic itself. There's a huge crisis, and they are, I would say, they are weaker than the academic community, which at least have some sort of stability in their professions, a highly mobilized community. I would start by saying this, but this is something I'm learning by doing, so to say.
Thanks for that reflection, experiential learning, Conrado. But think about this politically and to organize both publicly and also kind of a really important message.
Yeah, on a more concrete level, I agree with all the things Conrado said. As an add-on, I can say the organization is very important. For example, right after we were purged, the trade union that I was a member of started to give us a modest amount of payment allowance. Everyone. So I still don't know how they managed to do it, but they still do it back in Turkey. Very modest allowance, but that trade union syndicate of educators are giving money. Of course, it's in the target of the government and pro-government syndicates that they always deal with these accusations of terrorism, etc. But they still fight for it. And also the politicians who are not, of course, on the other side, but the like Republican politicians or pro-Kurdish politicians, we had made too many cooperations like ad hoc works or payments, etc., for consultations. But the sad part is I couldn't put them on my CV, but because they were also scared of openly employing a person like public enemy like us. So we were doing it in the back door. That was another thing. On an international level, there's also all the universities and the groups like Scholars at Risk, Scholar Rescue Fund, and in Germany, also in France, they have their own local inter-university platforms that help people like us.
Yeah. Thanks for raising that, the financial aspect of it, which can be quite serious, whether it's legal bills or actually your entire employment. Tom, do you want to reflect at all on that?
Yeah, just real quick. I mean, so I agree with everything that Gökhan and Conrado said. And, so like on the one hand, like academics should continue to be organizing collectively as academics, right? And particularly like international solidarity, right? So like US and academics who are in a position of relative privilege should be doing whatever they can, or Norwegian academics should be doing whatever they can to help folks who are facing severe threats to academic freedom elsewhere. And then the other thing I would add is to just, and this I think ties in with some of Conrado's points, is for just academics to bear in mind the connections between threats to academic freedom and the broader issues of democratic backsliding, right? Because it's, if academics in a given country are treating it solely as like defending our guild-like prerogatives, not only is that not going to work because we don't have enough political power, but it even like potentially plays into the hands of the anti-elitist discourse of the populist movements and the like. Whereas if we're uniting together with media and artists and voting rights advocates and minority rights advocates and the like, who are all facing severe threats, right? Gender equality advocates and LGBT rights advocates who are all facing severe threats from the democratic backsliding, then obviously, like, you know, unseating these authoritarian populist movements from state power is not going to make all threats to academic freedom go away. But they are the most severe current threat to academic freedom. And if we don't unseat these movements from state power, then it is difficult to see what, you know, academics might be able to rally around a particular case here and there and help one person who got fired or help prevent one person from getting fired, and we should do that. But the bigger problem is kind of expanding the scope of the conflict. It's not just about the rights of academics, right? It's a broader issue of the collapse of democratic norms and institutions in these countries that we need to fight back against.
Well, thanks very much, Tom, for adding that, you know, emphasizing that sort of fourth point about alliance building and not staying in our ivory towers and recognizing the synergies and with others who are also threatened. Also, that point of Conrado about also non-reactive mobilization. I mean, we were involved in creating a nationwide mobilization in Norway a few years ago against commercialization proposals. So we got 5,000 signatures around the media, and we won. It stopped, and then, you know, the movement stops as well. But, you know, we lose battles on a daily, small battles on a daily basis with changes to this and that on how we teach, because we're not effectively organized. So I think it's a really important point. So when the bigger threats come, we're even less prepared. I have a question from Syria, but I also want to say at least Lena Hitler, who's also on chat, had exactly the same question as me. So I hope, Lena, you also got an answer there. Syria.
So this said, thank you first for a wonderful panel. It's super stimulating and important. It follows up on the same issue. And I was just thinking about sort of both in the US and in Brazil, the differences between private and public universities and the conditions of academic freedom and also in Turkey. But you see differences, and also sort of threats against institutions versus threats against, or pressure against institution versus individual strong voices, whether there are sort of more disciplining of institutions and so on.
Yeah, I mean, I'll jump in real quick. I mean, so in the US, I think we have something like 6,000 colleges and universities, right, of all kinds. And so, you know, one of the, and it's a mix of public and private, right? And some of our most prestigious universities are private, but some of our most prestigious universities are also public. And so, as with our media landscape, right, it is an important, this sort of rich and deeply rooted and institutionalized set of civil society institutions is a brake on democratic backsliding, right? It's an advantage that we have that makes it harder, right? It's, you know, state legislators in Texas who are trying to ban the teaching of critical race theory, right? They have more control over state universities in Texas than they do over private universities in Texas. And they don't have any control over private universities in other states, right? And so it does give us a little bit of leeway, right? And so individual academics who are persecuted and targeted, there's a greater chance that they can find a home somewhere else, right, in the country. But But that said, right, the movement, the authoritarian populist movement's goals are to put limits on on faculty at all of these colleges and universities. And so I do think it's an important kind of reminder of the need for solidarity, right? Like, so some of us, I'm at a private university in New York where we're not facing any direct threat from authoritarian populist movements presently, but we should be doing whatever we can to help our colleagues at public universities in Texas or wherever else, right? So it does give us some added protections, I think, that very decentralized and mix of public and private institutions that we have. But it's not a guarantee of immunity from these threats.
Thanks very much, Tom, for mapping the US situation. Conrado?
Yeah, very quickly on Siri's point. In the Brazilian university system, there is a really stark difference between the public system and the private system. There is nothing compared to a tenure or stability to academics in the private universities. And private universities are fragile environments for doing public criticism, I would say, to start with. Professors in the best private universities in the country, and there are not many really good private universities in the country, but there are a couple. They don't feel safe for criticizing a justice of the Supreme Court. And I'm talking about the best ones. I'm talking about the Getúlio Vargas Foundation. I'm talking about the Catholic universities and so on. Because a justice of the Supreme Court system can call the president of the university and ask for some sort of sanction. In terms of institutional design, the universities, the public universities, I would say, is much more prepared because there are lots of institutional guarantees. So this wall between the university and the public sphere and the public democratic institutions and government, etc., this does exist. But of course, we can also mention sometimes problems of academic freedom within public universities, which are related to defunding or conflicts among different ideological factions, and how some particular academics are harassed. But all this within a legal design which has pretty much legal protection. It is really hard to fire an academic in a public university for expressing their opinion, for the kind of research he does, and etc. This is not difficult at all in a private university. So I would say, really simplifying, there are exceptions, etc., but I would say this.
Thanks, Conrado. Well, that's an interesting comparison there, where perhaps it's you're less protected at a public university in the US, but more protected at a public university in Brazil. Whereas I think the situation in Turkey is
more or less same with Brazil, but there are some slight differences. For example, I have to also distinguish between before 2016, where there were many, or not many, but maybe a considerable number of private universities, very well established, and where all academic freedom and quality was observed totally. And also, besides that, there were also some state universities. But after 2016, when the government learned to really crash the universities, the difference a little bit blurred between them. But we see the effects of commodification of education in the private universities, which adds to the state authoritarianism, which makes it worse than many sort of public universities. Now, okay, in private universities, the freedom is lost, but the commodification stays there. So this happened, what I call, in most of the universities in Istanbul, highway universities, because of the cheap land. They are always built around the highways, out of the city, out of nowhere, in the middle of nowhere, and they just the working conditions are very harsh. and they just sell the diplomas for money. Just there's some universities like that. So yeah.
Academic capitalism makes popular authoritarianism on the road, literally. I just want to finish with a sort of personal question. I mean, I've been subject to a defamation threat for empirical research we did on international arbitrators, a network analysis of where they played double roles. And there was a threat to start a case in the UK, which would have led to $1 million legal bill. And I found out I had absolutely no protection from my own university, no legal support, even in Norway. And then it's nothing compared to the situation in Brazil and Turkey, but I had to suddenly face a situation that I could be bankrupted through such a case, I could lose my home. And so I'm just Gökhan and Conrado, if you could just reflect also personally what it's like to be in this situation, how you've tackled it. Because I think, given that many others will have to go through this, and how you actually cope with it on a daily basis, it must be important for you in surviving and even thriving and being here today. If you can, you don't have to, but if you can.
Well, this is something that I've been thinking. Was I happier back in Turkey? I was thinking, because when you have nothing to lose, you really feel that freedom. And now that I'm started a new life and I have things to worry about, the anxiety came back. You know, what will happen next year? What will happen to this article? It's going to be published, or am I going to do well in this round table? Back in Turkey, in that 4 years, it was a sort of feeling of freedom that I have experienced, and I really advise everyone to feel that freedom, that feeling of freedom. Now I turn back to normal. Now here in Norway, now normal anxieties came back. But that day, the only anxiety was that just finding the money for that month's rent, and finding the money for food, and money for food for the cats. And that's it. And that was the only anxiety.
There could be existential benefits of also fighting. But how much research did you produce in that time?
I just 2 book parts in English and some speeches and articles in Turkish. Yeah, it went well, relatively okay. Yeah.
Amazing. So even under all of that, you're actually able to,
Your mind is clear, so you don't have anxiety.
So perhaps we have too much luxury.
Maybe that's what I've been thinking now.
Okay. So we need to take a more Gandhian approach. Conrado, your reflection.
That's a good question, and I've been writing in the public sphere, in public newspapers, etc., for a couple of years now, and I've always been really critical about some particular political actors that I study, mainly the Supreme Court and Supreme Court justices individually. And what I do has become known as slightly more aggressive than the legal community tends to be, the academic legal community as well. So many people, much before Bolsonaro, asked me, well, do you fear to be prosecuted, etc.? And I always trusted that would make no sense for various reasons. But what I said basically was not something that I could characterize as defamation, etc. But going out forward to my current case, I think the main anxiety here is more about the political situation in the country than about my individual case. And I don't feel so stressed about my individual case for a couple of reasons. First, I'm supported by really good lawyers, and the case is really gross. It's incompatible with anything that the Brazilian case law has produced in terms of freedom of expression. It is too clearly a case of intimidation. And those authorities that are suing me have been so much criticized by everyone in the media. So all these conditions combined make me not too stressful. It is quite early. This case can last for some time. Of course, it's time consuming. Now I have a legal team with whom I need to talk every 2 weeks or so, to think about strategies, to think about what I should say or not in the public sphere. And I haven't censored myself yet, at least consciously. But I would say that there is a climate, a complicated climate. I can see academics taking a lot of care in what they say and what they teach. But again, in my personal case, I think that all those characteristics made my case slightly less fearful or frightening. But I think more about that. I haven't thought much. I have been living the moment of a big public noise and lots of support and responding to that. So it's been stressful and exciting at the same time.
Thanks a lot. I was also interested in whether the self-censorship was actually an issue there. So thanks for reflecting on that. So thanks for everybody for a wonderful panel. I actually hope we might even produce something out of this, because I think these reflections are really important in this particular moment. The reflections on the importance of organizing, of having support. You've just been talking about your legal team, but also supporting other sectors of society, since we're all in the same boat here. Recognizing threats across borders, but also the peculiarities within borders. But I think also what Gökhan has just talked about is that, you know, in some ways, that existential moment, you're actually fighting for the core of what we do, which is freedom. And there is something also important or exhilarating in that, but that's the core of what we do. And are we prepared to actually fight for that? You know, are we prepared to literally, you know, die for academic freedom? So I think that's, in some ways, existential question that I would like to leave everybody with. It. How important is it for us? So thanks very much, and thank particularly to the panel for sharing so much, both academically but also personally.